And Dad, who'd spent his whole career in the mining industry, said, "You do know you can't work on a mine. We don't hire women engineers in the mining industry." And I said, "Well, it's a 4-year course. Maybe things will change." I had no view about an exit. It was really interesting because I also had no view about courage and the ability to be decisive with very little information are the two most important things for an early stage director. And then one Monday morning when Peter said, "Why don't you just get someone to come and run research solutions for you?" Who would do that? Interestingly, he had an answer. He said, "I think we talk a lot about how hard done by female founders are. If I could change one thing in New Zealand, I would."
Today's guest is Debra Hall. She's a luminary in angel circles in New Zealand, but to get there, she first had to start, grow, and exit a company, which she did a fabulous job on. It's a long episode, but we cover so many interesting bases in this conversation. The journey of growth and success of her business, navigating her way through a world that was just evolving in its sophistication and place in the world from a market research perspective. And then we spend about half to 2/3 of the way in the conversation. We jump into governance and its importance, how to make it work, what constitutes great directorship in a business. So if you're considering governance, getting into it yourself or building a governance board, or if you'd like to do it better, this is a super, super valuable conversation. And at the very back end, we talk about female foundership, and Deb has some really strong views that I think that you'd really like to take a listen to. It's a wonderful episode. Please enjoy. And thank you for joining the show, Debra Hall.
Hi, Josh. Thanks for inviting me.
What a pleasure to have this conversation with you today. So, as you know, with the start of this dialogue, it's always a great opportunity for you to introduce yourself to the audience. So, I'm really curious on the Debra backstory.
The backstory, right. Okay, so my ancestors travelled across the ocean from Europe about 300 years ago, not to New Zealand, to South Africa. And so 17 and 1800s, came from Germany and Holland and a little bit of British and settled there. And so I'm multi-generational South African. And through the years at school, I'd kind of been identified as academically gifted, I suppose. And there was this narrative in the family that I was going to be a doctor. Nobody in my family on either side had ever been to university. And here they had this child that was going to be a doctor, which was, I guess, in their view, the pinnacle of academic success and career success. And I got all the way to the orientation day at med school.
So you'd been accepted to med school?
I had a scholarship. Wow. And because in South Africa you often were funded through university by private scholarships. And going through the orientation day, and about 2 hours in, I looked around and I went, what am I doing here? These are not my people. I don't even like sick people. Bear in mind, I was only 16 at this point. Yes. And so I wandered out and wandered around the campus and happened in on the engineering faculty where I kind of found my people. Even though they didn't look a lot like me, I have to say.
You were the first female accepted into that course, right?
Yes, so I went home and I told my parents that the good news was I was going to university. The bad news was we had to have a little rethink about what I was going to do. And I was going to be a metallurgical engineer. And Mum, bless her, was just, whatever you like, dear, that sounds fine to me. And Dad, who'd spent his whole career in the mining industry, said, "You do know you can't work on a mine." And I went, "Why?" He said, "Because women are not allowed to work in production roles on mines. Engineers, we don't hire women engineers in the mining industry." And I said, well, it's a 4-year course. Maybe things will change. The computers kind of arrived after that. This was the 1970s. When computers arrived, I could touch type at 100 words a minute.
Right. Yes.
And, which was a good skill.
A unique advantage, yeah.
But it was true. It was actually against the law for a mine to employ a female engineer. And so I got a scholarship from another mining company, not the one my father worked in, and I set off on this engineering adventure. First year engineering across all faculties. There were 6 women out of about over 1,000 men.
Wow.
And the lecturer in the first lecture said, look to your right, look to your left. He said, next year only one of the 3 of you will be here. And that was pretty true. There were indeed 2, not specifically to the woman, but to everyone in the class.
2/3 dropout rate from year 1 to year 2. That's remarkable.
It was remarkable.
Wow.
And there were only 2 girls left after that. The years in, I had our first child, and Peter's bank decided they were going to move him to Hong Kong. So we went on this adventure to Hong Kong for 2 years. It was kind of the mid-1980s. We were there while the handover was being negotiated with Britain, which was super exciting. It was the longest holiday I've ever had because, of course, I couldn't work. And we were there on expat terms, and the bank was paying for everything. It was fantastic. And it was my first kind of out of South Africa cultural experience. I'd been brought up in this incredibly insular, my parents never travelled out of South Africa, or hardly ever out of South Africa. And so I'd been brought up with this mantra that South Africa's given you everything, all your skills and talents, and you need to stay and use them here. And my husband had been brought up to explore the world, basically. And so he dragged me kicking and screaming to Hong Kong for 2 years only. We left all our stuff in storage. And when I got to Hong Kong, I discovered that things were not as I thought they were in South Africa. And I was never going back. And so...
Can I ask specifically, is that in relation to the
to the politics? Yes. I mean, obviously, I grew up on a mine. Obviously, I was well immersed in the whole apartheid system.
Yeah.
Super. Although we were not wealthy as white people, we were super privileged. But we didn't realize it. But, there were things about history that I just had never heard of, that people out in the outside world knew about. And, my parents had protected me from knowing about all that stuff. And even at school, I mean, I'd got an A in history and I'd never heard of Nelson Mandela.
Wow.
So how do you control? I mean, it wouldn't be possible these days because of the internet and stuff like that. But so after 2 years in Hong Kong, Peter was approached to come down to New Zealand and work in a bank here. 1986 in New Zealand was a very, very exciting time financially.
Yes.
The first Long E. Douglas government was in.
Deregulation.
They were deregulating the banks. There was this bank called Auckland Savings Bank that wanted to become a real bank, I suppose you would say. And so he was recruited to help set up the treasury operation for ASB. There was this little ad. There were community newspapers in those days. And the Howick and Pakuranga Times had this little classified ad saying that this company that I'd never heard of was looking for someone who had a university degree in anything and was able to translate data into written reports. And I went, I could do that. Let me see. So I sent in a application. And
I wrote a letter, I presume.
I wrote a letter explaining that I was, a stay-at-home mum and that I was looking for part-time work essentially, and because I was an engineer, I could do this task. I didn't say it, but it sounded quite trivial to me. And 2 days later, New Zealand Post was super quick in those days. So 2 days later, I got a phone call from this guy called Andy, who owned the company, which was a market research company. And he said, I need you to come in and talk to me. You sound just right for this job. And I went, well, I can't come in today. He said, I need you to come in today if possible. I said, well, I haven't got childcare, so can we do tomorrow? I'll see if the neighbours can look after the kids. And he said, bring them. he made this arrangement that he would employ me on an hourly rate. I would come in half a day a week to deliver last week's work and collect and be briefed on the next project.
So you actually invented remote working.
I did.
Accidentally.
It was work from home in 1987.
Yeah, wow, amazing.
And I mean, how forward thinking was that?
Yeah, that's incredible.
He was amazing.
Yeah.
And I'm always deeply grateful to him for that, because not only did it give me something intellectual to do, which I really needed, that I could do around the children, but it also gave me an opportunity to discover a whole new world of solving problems. When you solve engineering problems, there's a structural framework that you work with. There's Newton's law, and physics has rules.
Yes.
In those days, and to some extent still, I think, the rules around human behavior are not well formed. And that is what market research is essentially doing. It's trying to predict and influence how people decide what to do, how they decide what to buy, how they decide whether or not to recycle, or what they believe, and all those sorts of things. And so I found this whole new world. Market research or consumer analytics had existed when I'd gone to university. It's what I always would have done.
Oh, you were born to do it, kind of thing.
Because I found studying human behavior so much more rewarding than the engineering that I'd absolutely loved. And so about 4 years in, three to 4 years in, there was an unfortunate set of incidents in which Andy and I fell out. It had to do with how he was running the business. So I kind of got to the point where I thought, talked to Peter, and I thought, well, maybe we should buy the business or try to buy the business. And when that didn't work, and the relationships between Andy and I became tense, as you can imagine. So probably we didn't handle it very well, but the intent was good, because I kind of saw that we could add something in terms of, I didn't think of it in these terms, but now when I look back, it should have been a conversation about adding capital to shore up the firm while we moved forward to the next level of growth.
Yes, let's move forward together.
And it wasn't that sort of conversation. It was seen more as an attempt of a takeover. Exactly, and that was anyway. It is what it is.
Because those were the days, of course, of the M&A, the buyout, the roll-ups, the leverage buyouts, and asset stripping and that sort of stuff. So that was in the background.
Well, exactly.
So
exactly.
This is Rob Riley turning up.
But neither of us were business we're sophisticated in terms of businesses. And so my initial reaction was, well, I should go and work for another research company. So I made some applications. And by then I was not working from home. By then I was working like 60-hour weeks, some of it from home. And so I had some interviews with other research companies, and I always remember this one where the CEO looked at my CV of all the things I'd done, the uranium and the margarine and the cement and the research and so on, and he said, I just don't understand. When are you going to decide what you actually want to do with your life?
I would have thought the virtue that you were sitting in front of him for the interview would have been enough of a sign.
Well, true. Yeah. And so...
I guess you didn't join that guy.
Well, no, I went back to my desk and I wrote him a note thanking him for interviewing me, but please don't offer me your job because I'm not going to take it.
Good on you.
And I went home and my husband said, you don't have to work. Right. Just take a break. I was like, I'm not ready to take a break. I'm just getting started in this. And so he said, well, why don't you start your own business?
For you as a founder, you were a co-founder with a colleague and you had to navigate your way through a lot of early things that were unfamiliar to you. Yeah. And then you decided that I need to go this alone. What was that moment like when you realised that this is now my business. I'm the sole shareholder. I have a wonderful husband who's been giving me some really sage insight and wisdom along the way, but it's really on me. What did that moment feel like, Deb?
I just remember feeling relieved. Relieved that I no longer had to kind of push against the barriers to what could happen. I didn't know for sure that we would grow, but of course we did. And, I just felt this sense of relief that I no longer had to worry about keeping Judy happy.
Yes.
And that I could deal with the rest of the team, which was growing. I mean, we grew. I had the business for 15 years, and we grew to just over 100 people that we employed, which in New Zealand is a reasonable sized business.
It's a sizable firm.
Yeah, it wasn't the biggest research company.
Right.
But it was, I like to say it was the most awarded. So, we certainly were recognised in the industry for the innovation that we brought.
Yes.
Because, of course, when you come to something from a different perspective, Judy and I had agreed on one thing. In the days where we started the business, market research liked to position themselves as the scientists of the marketing industry. And part of that was that they felt they needed to keep themselves clean in terms of just giving the client the information. So they would just give the client the data and no advice about what, it's not our role to give advice, they would say. And indeed, that was part of why Andy should have been really happy that Judy and I left, is because we'd started exposing him to the risk that we were out there saying, well, here's your data, and here's what I think you should do about it.
You have an opinion, right? So
Yeah. And so I expressed the opinion once, while I was still working for Andy, I expressed the opinion about an advertising campaign that I'd researched on behalf of a very big client in the ad agency. We're presenting the results of this ad, which has unfortunately already been made. They chose not to test it before they made it. And it was one of those epic productions. And I was like, this is a dog. There's just no other way to describe it. This is a dog. People watch a 60-minute ad and they don't even know what the product is. This is a dog. Wow. And the ad agency head rang Andy before I even got back to the office and said, if you don't withdraw that report, I'll make sure you never work again in this industry.
Wow, that's quite a big claim.
So we were the researchers that got off the fence,
yes,
basically.
Right.
And that's the reputation we built. And because of that, we attracted the types of clients who wanted a more partnering relationship, who wanted us to become more embedded in their business, because, of course, the more we know about their business, the better our advice can be. Whereas at that time in other companies, clients would say, well, I'm not going to give you all the backstory because I don't want to taint the data by telling you what's actually going on. And so it was a completely different model.
Yeah. It's really interesting as a point in history as well, because you mentioned that when you studied at university, you weren't aware of marketing as being like an option, a career option. And then by the 1980s, 1990s, marketing had actually become almost in some senses a bit of a leading light for organisations.
Yeah.
And there's a story that I vividly recall from university, I think it was from university days, and it was the product testing around Coca-Cola. And there was some blind taste testing that was going on in a mall, and you're nodding, you probably remember the story. And they were given a cup of warm, not chilled, and a very small amount of Pepsi Cola and Coca-Cola.
Yep.
And at this stage, Pepsi's market share was growing rapidly, and Coke's was, being eroded. And so what I think, I forget the numbers, but it was something in the region of like 75% of people preferred Pepsi-Cola.
Preferred the taste, yes.
And so Coke then went and re-engineered its unbelievably incredible, famous formula based upon this market research outcome.
Yes.
And then they launched this product into market, and they just kind of did a bit of a bait and switch with us as consumers. And then consumers are like, whoa, what's happened to my Coke flavour?
Yeah.
And then they realised that actually the flavour that we had before was the thing that our drinkers liked. And so they dug into the market research and discovered that it was warm, it was a sip, not a whole can.
Yeah.
It was in a really quick kind of setup, and so the flavour conditions were set up to favour Pepsi as opposed to Coke. And so what people don't necessarily know is that by now, 20 years into the industry evolution, is that market research has had a lot of power. And so did you experience that? And what was that experience like?
Yeah, it is true. And, the thing that I always held on to as a market researcher is that there's actually no truth here, because we go out and in those days we ask people what they buy. There were some seminal studies where people went and asked people what they buy and then said, go to your cupboard and show me. And it turned out what they'd said they were buying was not what they were buying at all. And things like that. And so you're tapping into this human recall, emotion. And one of the things that I learned quite early on is that the power of the brand to change what you actually think is absolutely enormous. It's just overwhelming in terms of the taste of something is often. I mean, when I was working with Andy, one of my colleagues used to do blind tastings of beer here in New Zealand, and people would become quite aggressive if you told them that the one they'd preferred was, not their brand, the DB versus Lion in those days.
It was huge.
And if you told them they'd preferred the one that they had said was not their preferred one. Yeah, well, yeah. So it's such a fascinating thing to be able to understand how people decide, and then to use that to create commercial success for clients.
And interestingly, you made the stance early on in your business growth research solutions that you would not just be the ambivalent, let's say, or indifferent presenter of the data, but rather you'd have a consultant's lens across it and provide some insights. Because now what we know is that data is almost irrelevant. Anyone can get data. It's your ability to extract meaningful insights, actionable insights from that. So you made the decision to do that. Did that stand you out from your competitors? Is that one of the things that enabled your business to grow, do you think?
It did. It also meant that the structure of our business was different, because it meant I needed to have a pool of more senior people, more experienced people running the projects and not devolving the actual work down to armies of juniors. So it enabled us to kind of form, I suppose, what if you'd looked in from the outside, would be more of a consulting business than, and what in those days, what was a classical market research company. And our most senior people, our account managers, literally worked on the data themselves. They weren't just the front person who dealt with the client.
Yeah, got it.
And for me, that was super rewarding because that was what I was good at. But of course, the challenge then became that I was trying to run the business. And as market research moved more and more onto telephones before the internet, I did see the internet come in before I retired. But we eventually had a 35-seat call centre.
Wow.
And all of that took a lot of managing, I suppose you'd call it.
Yeah, resources, investment, capital expense, which is quite different
and that management role, I was singularly unequipped for that.
I'm just going to jump in and clarify a couple of things here. So you worked for Andy, endeavoured to do in his eyes a aggressive takeover, decided with some encouragement from wonderful Peter that you should get out and start a business, which you did with Judy. You then purchased Judy's shares from her and then had control of the business. You felt relief. You'd had these experiences which you would have now had the cognizance to go, those things there, these were the mistakes that we made along the way. So what decisions did you then make about how to grow research solutions into the future based upon the experiences that you had up to that point in time? In terms of structure of management, cadence of how you ran the business, those kind of decisions.
So I was still pretty much running the business.
Yeah.
I did, once we had the call centre, I did have an HR manager / call centre manager role in place. It never occurred to me to get a board, which in hindsight, as we'll talk about later, in hindsight, was an interesting decision that would have helped me enormously to have a board. I had this group of very senior account managers who together we kind of decided what projects we were going after, what we were doing. And one of the things that we always had in place was a very rigorous tracking system that was self-built in Excel, go figure, of every project. So we could tell there were timesheets, we could tell the profitability of every project. We had an office manager who was like the office mum, and she was making sure everything was running and that invoices were sent and stuff like that. But I didn't think of it as having a formal management structure. And until it got to the point where I couldn't do it anymore.
What stage was that? In terms of headcount?
About 80, I think.
80? Oh, wow. I thought you were going to say 8.
Yeah, no. Wow. I was a slow learner, Josh.
Oh, okay. That's a big business.
I'd reached the point. Yes, I'd reached the point where I was like, I'm spending my whole day on management stuff.
Right. And I'm guessing that's not a superpower.
Not a
thing that you'd love to do.
Not a superpower.
Yeah.
And then I'm taking my projects, my pet projects for my pet clients, some of whom were gigantic. I mean, I was doing brand work for Commonwealth Bank of Australia. Oh, wow. So some of my clients were enormous. And I was taking all that work home and doing that at night. Yes. So I was not a happy person.
Yeah.
And I had a teenage son at that point who, when I arrived home from work, would be standing on the doorstep saying, "So, Mum, hi, Mum, what's for dinner?" And I'm like...
You're getting it from all sides, basically.
So I'd started talking about how hard it was to resign from your own business, which I now see, I see the signs in founders now that I work with, that sense of, I'm just done.
Yeah. And was it, I talk about this with people as being, people fall out of love with their business because often there's a deep connection, especially with your first entity, and our identity gets tied up in it. And so you have this kind of sense of ownership, of love, all these sorts of things. So was that the place that you found yourself in?
Yeah, I was definitely out of love with it.
Right.
I still loved doing the client work.
Practitioning.
Yeah, the practitioning, yes. The stuff I was good at.
Yes.
And so it took quite a long time for me to figure out how to deal with this. And then one Monday morning when I didn't want to go to work because I just couldn't face it anymore, Peter said, "So why don't you just get someone to come and run research solutions for you?" I went, "What?
I can do that."
Who would do that? And interestingly, he had an answer, though. He said, "There's that guy that you keep interviewing. Every time you advertise a senior account manager role, a research director role, that guy applies, and you've offered him the role twice now, and he hasn't taken it." He said, the last time he didn't take it, you told me that he said his reason for not taking it was that he saw his career path as moving into management, and because Research Solutions was so tightly held and owned by you, he didn't see the opportunity to move into management.
This is a great story.
So I went,
Interesting. So Peter was kind of acting as your informal board.
As a board, yes. I mean, if I'd had a board, they would have told me, hopefully, they would have been brave enough to tell me long before that that was the solution. And I subsequently, I said to him, what took you so long to tell me? And he said, you weren't ready to hear it.
Yeah, right. You had to have that moment to get to the stage. So did you hire the guy?
I did.
Yeah.
I did. Okay. I rang him that day. I said, do you want to come and run Research Solutions? And he went, what? The timing was also good because he was in a transition. The company he worked for was being taken over, or there was something going on in his business.
Yeah, got it.
And he said, what? Where are you going? I said, no, I'll work for you. I'm not going anywhere. I want to go back to working with clients.
Yes.
And so we had a chat and we made a deal. And the deal was very much around, it looked almost like a co-founder deal.
Wow.
So there was an equity stake in exchange for reaching targets, basically.
ESOP, basically.
Yes, although it wasn't structured like, but I think they'd call it a shadow share scheme or something like that in those days.
Yeah.
And I always remember I gathered the team together. Almost all of our team was in Auckland. I gathered the team together in the call centre, which was the only area big enough. And I brought him in and I introduced him and I said, he'll be running Research Solutions now. And there was like this stunned mullet silence from the whole team.
Someone dropped a glass.
The first person to speak said, are you dying? And it was like a terminal illness diagnosis was the only possible thing she could think of that would explain why we were suddenly going to have someone else running the company.
Yes, well, because you were Research Solutions, right? And their eyes.
And, much as I say I hated running the company and I was not good at it, I was super good at leading the team.
Right.
And so they were not unhappy with how the company was being run.
Yeah, it's that great leader but poor manager kind of paradox. Yeah.
Totally.
Yes.
And so there was that. And then, so he started and he took the office.
Yes, okay, the corner office with the rubber plant. Yep.
And I took a desk out I loved working in the open plan space anyway. I'd always had, even when I had the office.
Yes.
The only thing my team complained about was that I wouldn't have an office.
Right.
I always worked in the open plan area with everyone else.
Right.
And then as we grew and we took on more floor space, basically, eventually there was this thing that was Debra's office, which was seldom populated, but it was there. So the new general manager took the office happily, and I went back to my desk in the open plan area.
Yes, happily.
And very happily. And for about the first 2 weeks, every single day I would get an email from one of the team saying, he says this. We're just wondering what you think.
Go and check with Mum.
And I had a cut and paste that I sent back saying, he is running the company now. What I think no longer matters.
Wow.
And not that it didn't matter to me.
No, of course.
But I knew
you had to
that
support.
The day I stood up and said, I'm sorry, that's not how we do things around here.
Yes.
He would be out the door and I would be left holding the baby
back in the same place again. Yeah. I'm going to pause on this because this is something that I think I need to laud you for the maturity that you approach this with. You know, you said that it was looking me in the face and timing and that sort of stuff, but you need to be ready to take that step to bring someone into the business. And there's a couple of things that I wanted to highlight there. The first is that the maturity that you had to bring in essentially a co-founder in about year 10, year 12 of the
year
business.
10 maybe.
Yeah, year 10. So that's a long way down the path. And so for those that are watching and listening that are in the entrepreneur place or that early on in their business, their first 2 or 3 years or so, it's okay to go and find a co-founder at year 3, 4, 5 or 10.
Absolutely.
It's okay. Treat them as an equal.
Never too late.
It's never too late, right?
No.
Especially once you have that moment of realization that you're in a place of functionally not enjoying a lot of the work that you do. And I see this so often. That's the first thing I want to highlight. And the second thing I want to double click on this is that many people reach this stage and they hire a GM, a CEO, whatever you want to call that person, and then they don't do what you did, which is to go, I need to support this person, especially in a public forum. And then I'm imagining that you had the right forum set up in place in terms of management meetings and reporting and that sort of stuff, but I will get to that in a second. But I need to publicly be seen to support this person. And what I see happen all the time, founders complain to me, look, I tried to hire a general manager, but it just didn't work for the business. And I said, how did that go down? And I said, well, they kept on making all these bad decisions and I had to keep on reversing these decisions. That's typically the thing that I see and hear about time and time again. And I have to sit them down and say, look, I think the problem was not them. It was you. And that's a really hard thing for people to hear. So what did you do other than support him publicly? What were the other things that you did to support? Can we get a first name? Ian.
Yes.
What did you do to support Ian to make sure that he succeeded for himself, for you, and for the business?
I kept notes. I mean, it sounds petty childish, but I kept notes. So every time he did something that I was like, really? I would write it down. And then
Apologies for the interruption, and thanks for listening to the show. These shows take resources to build and put together. We have a team of producers, we have some promoters behind the scenes, and of course we have the guests that generously give their time to come on the show. My only ask of you is that you go and check out my website. I advise founders on how to build value and how to navigate the exit process successfully. We have a diagnostic on the website. There's an ebook that I've written. There's a free chapter of my upcoming book, Wantrepreneur, on there. So I'd just urge you to take a couple of minutes and go and check out joshcomrie.com.
Then once a month we would go off-site, him and I, and Peter as the other shareholder of the business, and we would have what I suppose you would call a board meeting of sorts, where I would show him my list of all the things that he'd done wrong that I'd wanted to intervene on but hadn't.
Oh, the patience you must have had to have once a month. I'll keep this. Yes, okay. How did Ian deal with those things?
He was very patient.
Yeah, wow.
I'm sure I'm sure there were times he felt attacked. But he was very resilient and we just worked through it. He would defend himself, which, I'm me, so if you don't defend yourself, that frustrates me more than anything.
Yes.
So either say you've got a point or say, no, actually, I still think I'm right.
Yeah, right, yes.
And let's talk about this and talk about how it played out. The beauty of doing it once a month is that many of the things had time to play out by then.
And so you realised that was
occasionally I would even take things off my list by the time we got to the end of the month because it had been okay in the end. He was. I could see that he was right.
Yes.
It helped that I thought I hadn't been good at running the company.
Yeah, right.
So I was also open to the idea that there were different ways of doing things.
Yes.
And so, one of the first things he did was he came and he said, "So where's the business plan?" I went,
About that.
We just grow.
Yes.
So then he said, so how much tracking have we got? Because market research companies have like a base cash flow from tracking business that they contract from particular clients to do the same thing over and over and over again. Now, neither Judy nor I were interested in doing the same thing over and over again. So we had almost no tracking business. And Ian said, well, how do you know you're going to meet payroll next month if you rely on ad hoc projects all the time? And so we moved into tracking business to give him sufficient cash flow resilience. and things like that. But yeah, we would sit down, we would argue it out. We would drink too much wine together that night, and we would go away friends and ready to fight the next fight for the next month.
Yeah, great.
And over time, the list got shorter.
Yes.
And
so you kind of normalised and
we
kind of found a
normalised,
good place to meet
yes,
and
absolutely,
then,
absolutely. And I learnt that not every fight is worth fighting. You know, it's a good thing to learn as a parent as well.
and a partner, a spouse.
And a partner.
Yep.
Save your effort for the things that really, really matter to you.
Yeah, pick your
and so
battles.
for me, the things that always mattered the most were culture.
Okay.
Because the people, when I think of my business success, I don't think about the exit. I think about all the people whose lives were changed by the fact that I could give them a job. And so the culture to me was always super important.
At what stage did you start to consider the notion of an exit? Let's talk through that journey.
I had no view about an exit. It was really interesting because I also had no view about succession. So the sense of, because I still owned the majority, although I'd given Ian founder shares, I still owned the majority of the business. And part of the way that we grew was we got involved with an international network of research companies. There was this product, which in those days it was quite unusual for there to be research products. But these guys in Cape Town had developed, who I didn't know when I was in South Africa, that was coincidental. They had developed this market research tool called the conversion model that could literally predict how close people were to changing their mind.
Wow.
And it really appealed to me. It was super mathematically based, and it really worked. You know, I used to use it at cocktail parties to determine how attached people were to their partners and things like that. It literally measures how committed you are to your current behaviour.
Oh, wow.
And if you're not, if you're drifting away, how likely you are to change.
Yes.
And what you would do to change. So super useful to marketers.
Totally.
And so I had secured a license to use the conversion model in New Zealand and Australia. And these guys in Cape Town had been going around the world licensing it to research companies on a geographically constrained basis. So country licenses, basically. They'd stuffed up in Australia because they already had 2 licensees there when I came along. And I said, well, since you've got 2 in Australia, you might as well have 3. Can I have Australia too? And so we were using that in our research here, and we were being, from their perspective, super innovative about what we were doing with it, whereas their other partners were using it for washing powder and banking relationships. We started using it for recycling. How committed are you to recycling? Those belief-based systems. So
Yes.
we had a great practice around that. And we had this relationship with all these other research companies in the world. 9 months of due diligence to buy what was a tiny company in New Zealand. Thousands of pages of due diligence stuff. That, again, Peter was super helpful because, if I hadn't had him, I would never have been able to do the deal. And in the end, we did the deal in November, 1st of November, I think, 2007, so just before the crash. I'd like to say my timing was perfect, but I had no sense of what was coming next.
Yeah.
We dealt with the not ready for sale aspect by having a decent slab on earnout,
Okay.
which I'm super proud to say we made despite the crash coming,
Well done.
which was amazing. In part, it was enabled by one clause in the sale and purchase agreement, which said that head office could not force me to do anything that I felt would limit my ability to make earnout.
Wow, that's an unusual clause.
And so when in January 2008, the missive came that all Synovate officers had to cut their staff by X% because of the crash, I said no.
Yeah, wow.
Can't do that. And so that ability to keep my team basically enabled us to make the earnout.
Yeah. As much as you're able to share, acknowledging that there's some confidentiality that sits in behind the deal, if I was to ask you what proportion of the transaction was upfront versus an earnout?
I think about a third was up front. So
Okay. Yeah,
it was less than half.
Yeah, left 2/3 on the table. Okay.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
You know, it was a vote of confidence from me that said, I can do this.
Yes.
With Ian.
Yes.
He was obviously in on
Yes.
the deal from the beginning.
Yes.
And although he hadn't quite reached the point, due to time, he hadn't quite reached the point of triggering what I'd promised him.
Right.
We agreed that if the deal went ahead,
Anyway.
he would get it anyway.
Yeah.
And then for the rest, I was comfortable with doing that.
Yes.
Because I had confidence that we'd built a solid business here. I think in hindsight, they had a number of reasons to buy us. They'd put in almost like a beachhead office out of Australia into Wellington about 18 months prior to that with 2 people in it. And they'd they were trying to establish an office in New Zealand. Part of the international client relationships were kind of contingent on, we'll use a global research company because they'll have an office in every country we want to do research in. So one of the drivers for them buying us was to buy an established business with a solid reputation here in New Zealand, to have a New Zealand office. And, you know, to be honest, I think they were buying, it was also in part an acqui-hire play because they were buying me.
Yes.
And the team I'd built that was doing this amazing work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. Acqui-hire, for those that are unaware, is when you buy the company for the people, more than you necessarily do for the customers or for the EBIT. Over what duration was your earnout period? Was it a 2-year, 3-year, longer?
It was, we were kind of halfway through a financial year.
Yeah.
And so it ran 2 more financial years after that.
Okay. Yeah, that's quite a long earnout. One of the things that I often observe with people is that the earnout is the most difficult part of the deal for them, and they frequently actually exit the business before that period has played out because of the experience of seeing their baby getting treated in ways that they didn't intend it to be. And so that clause that you managed to get inserted in there is really a stroke of genius. Was that through advisors that made that suggestion? Was it an instinct of yours?
It wasn't my instinct, no.
Yeah,
It must have come from advisors. I don't know. It was part of the how do we structure an earnout in a way that makes it okay to leave so much money in the earnout.
My reflection on that would be that one of the reasons that you were able to see the earnout through successfully is that isolation is what you mentioned was one. Achieve what you set out to achieve.
Yes.
Is another. You clearly had a good relationship with the acquiring party in Synovate and the regional manager, for lack of a better term.
The deal sponsor in
the
Perth.
deal sponsor, and you were able to establish autonomy and continue to run the business with Ian in the way that you needed to. And so, for those that perhaps freak out about the notion of an earnout, there's kind of a bit of a checklist of things that would enable you to kind of go, I've got some comfort around this, especially when there's a global party involved.
Yeah.
So you saw through the earnout. One of the key thrusts of this conversation we talked about, let's kind of shift gears a little bit into the notion of angel investing, and particularly let's talk about governance in relation to angel investing. So when did you start? When did you make your first investment?
So I stayed in for the earnout, obviously, and then I started making trouble, so I retired.
can never see that happening.
No, I know, totally unpredictable. So I, at the same time, my husband had retired from his banking career, and while I knew that when I retired, I knew I wanted to be a director. Because I'd been consulting at kind of senior executive and board level in some of our clients, I'd looked at what boards do, and I was like, this is my next gig. Okay. This is definitely my next gig. So it's quite conscious,
yeah.
And so I knew Peter had retired. He, on the other hand, had taken to retirement like a duck to water, as in cycling, music, no interest in doing anything else.
Good on him.
And I was worried about him. I was worried that he wasn't getting out enough.
Yeah, for men especially.
So I pushed him out the door to what was then Ice Angels.
Yes.
Super hard to get in. It looked like a secret society from the outside.
Yeah.
Anyway, I managed to find him a way in, and he'd started going to the meetings, and then when I retired, I started going with him to the meetings. So that was probably 2010, I suppose, ish. And we started our first investment. I think our first investment with Ice Angels was in a company called Biomatters.
Oh, yes, familiar.
Which has exited.
Yes, it has. Yeah. Your first investment was an exit. That's funny. That was my experience as well. That's so funny.
And I just found that, again, I found this sense of this is where I want to work. I loved the founders. I loved the energy. And subsequently, my experience has been that as the company grows dramatically and starts heading, for example, towards an IPO, I'm no longer fit for purpose on that board because, in essence, they're doing too much compliance and too little strategy for me, not for them, but for me to make an impact, a contribution.
Yeah.
And so I started doing that, and then discovered it was really a sweet spot.
Yeah.
Suze Reynolds from the Angel Association approached me and said, we need more directors. How are we going to get more directors?
Yes.
And so she and I and a lady called Anne French, I think, developed the first Angel Association governance course or workshop, which I now run probably 4 or 5 times a year for the Angel Association, just trying to make it real in terms of what governance means in early stage business and how it's not the same as, obviously the legal structure is the same and the responsibilities are the same, but the role of governance in these early stage businesses is completely different.
Let's talk about that. So you've had the experience of working in those environments and taking businesses from start to scale, and then those that are at the next level, you've had the awareness of where your skill sets lie and also what the businesses need is something different, so you've stepped back. So what does constitute, this is a 2-part question, so I'll separate it out. So what constitutes great governance for a company that is at that start and scale phase?
Yeah, to me, it has to be right-sized. So you need to get a bunch of people. Firstly, the founders need to understand, I suppose, that this is not about putting in place the governance police to prevent them from doing stuff. Well, if they're going to go rogue, it is. Yeah. But most founders do not go rogue.
It's not the intention.
The purpose for them, I always say to founders, when do you need a board? You need a board when the responsibility of what you're doing is you're feeling that it should be shared, or you would feel better if you could share the responsibility of what you're doing with other people, because the board is responsible legally for what happens in the business. And so that sense of shared responsibility should give you a relief. You shouldn't be afraid of it. It's actually something that you should be pleased about if you put the right people there. And then what I say to directors, when I recruit directors for first boards or real kind of early, I say to them, your job is to enable the company to take as much risk as it possibly can without killing the founder or the business.
Okay, I love that as a statement, as a framing.
And if they look terrified, then they're not the right person.
Yes.
Because courage and the ability to be decisive with very little information are the two most important things for an early stage director. Assuming you've got integrity and the intent to do good and the belief in the business and all that stuff, courage and decisiveness are the things that enable a business to succeed. Yeah, I mean, the board's job is to make sure the company team, founders and their team, have the resources they need to make this company as great as it possibly can be. Mm-hmm. And yes, bad things happen along the way, and as you know, companies fail. We expect that.
Yes.
It's not always a failure of governance. It's not always a failure of the founders. Sometimes it is one or the other.
Yes.
But, if everyone is doing what they can to make the company succeed, it still doesn't always work.
Yeah, that's right.
But when it does, the founders, the executive team are the heroes because they've managed to execute on the plan. And the board is standing behind them in the sense that we're the people who have enabled you to do this by providing the framework and the resources and sometimes the protections along the way, the confidence to take enough risk, those sorts of things.
Yeah. Rowan Simpson's just released a book, and the opening chapter, I'm not sure if you've read the book or the opening chapter, I'm yet to get into the book itself, but the opening chapter, he was involved in TradeMe and Timely and I want to say Vend, and there's one other as well. Yeah. And we all know those now to be absolutely fabulous success stories. Mm-hmm. And he highlights in the opening chapter how all of them had at least one moment where they nearly died. Yep. And so, the whole thing around startups and scale-ups is that they are not a linear path to success. No. There's a huge amount of risk that's involved. There's a number of kind of critical decision paths that you need to be able to navigate successfully. And the old, pivot that we love to talk about is not one that can be taken lightly because, you can do it too often and kill the company, or you can do it too late and miss the opportunity that's in front of you, or you can just do the wrong kind of pivot into the wrong space completely. So I
think that's the point of Rowan's book: is there 100 ways to be wrong, or so, how to be wrong, or something like that.
Thank you. Yes, I've forgotten the title. That's exactly what it is. And so, if we talk about that role, the difference between the board and the executive team, I have come around in my thinking I used to think the board was responsible for, doing a lot of the strategic thinking and then passing it down to the executive team. I now think that it's the other way around. Executive team should form the strategy and then bring it up to the board for challenging and then ratification and then bring it back down and sign the thing off and go forward. What's your view on that? What's the right way for strategy to be formed?
I think in the beginning it's a joint process. Yeah. I think a lot of this, of course, depends on the founder. Look, if you've got a founder that's built businesses before, that knows how this works, or that is super competent and very comfortable taking full responsibility for everything, those founders do exist. Yeah. I just don't think everyone should be encouraged to model themselves on the 1% kind of thing. Yes, they're amazing, but not everyone is going to be like that. And so for the other 90% or whatever, I think in the beginning, strategy needs to be shared. Now, it's not always easy to do that because it relies on the board. You have to know enough about the industry and the product and the opportunity.
You need context, right?
And all of that to be able to frame a strategy. And so if the founder has to educate the board in all of that before they can have a meaningful strategic conversation, then just let the founder team or the executive team create the strategy and explain it to the board is the sensible way to do that. But if, on the other hand, the founder is technical and knee-deep in the doing and the creation of this thing. And the board is a group of people who either already have domain knowledge or who are willing to really upskill themselves and do the reading and form the straw man of what could be. Then doing it together is a much more effective use of the founder's time.
Yeah, got it.
And it means that one of the issues about the executive doing it is they often, in my experience, don't overlay here are the strategic choices, and each one of them has a different risk profile. And so that risk overlay, if it only comes to the board as here's what we recommend and here's the risk, the board hasn't had the input into how much risk we're willing to take. And I think that's where the board comes into its own, if it's a highly functioning board, is that sense of, well, we could have done that if you'd known that as a board we're willing to take that much risk.
Yes. Used a great expression there, if it's a highly functioning board, which has a supposition behind it that often they're not. And I've sat in those environments where they're not, and I'm sure that you have as well.
Yep.
What constitutes a highly functioning board, and how do you make sure, as a board member and as a chair, that is the environment which is created?
Firstly, pick people who are picked with purposeful selection of who's on the board is the first step. I'm particularly averse to board members who've been put there to watch over their investment.
Right.
In New Zealand, we have a habit or a practice that the VCs appoint someone from their company to be on the board who may or may not have any relevant skills or indeed any governance skills. I don't think that's serving they have director appointment rights. I'm not arguing about that. But I need them to appoint someone who fits into the skills matrix that we've got for this company, that we've identified what the skills we need are, and someone has to be an expert in each of those skills. So constructing the board around a skills matrix that says we need someone who knows about the tech. Because remember, being a director is not about having the answers. It's about asking the right questions. And we need someone on the board who knows enough. If you're in a AI-driven cybersecurity company, we need someone on the board who knows enough about that domain to be able to ask the technical people when they present to the board the right questions.
Yes.
And so that's how I construct the board. What domains do we need to be able to ask the right questions about?
Yes.
Markets, customers, tech, security, financial, etc.
Yes.
And then you need a strong chairman.
Yes.
Because the role of the chair is to get the most out of the people at the table. So and while contributing themselves. It's not a trivial task. And so it's the chairman's job to make sure the board functions well, and ideally that it's well constructed.
Mm-hmm.
And, I've been on boards that have imploded into people shouting and screaming at each other. Very, very bad. I've been on boards that are I'm on one at the moment that's super functional.
Yes.
And good boards review that regularly and refresh themselves when someone's skill set is no longer what the company needs for now and the next 2 years is how I think about it.
Yeah, okay. I've talked about this on the show before, but I'm going to drop it in here for those that haven't seen the episode. What I've observed about boards in New Zealand, and indeed executive teams, is that across any relationship spectrum, you've got harmony at one end and conflict at the other. And in the middle is this beautiful thing, which is tension.
Yeah.
And tension is where good ideas come from, productive conversations, people are heard out properly, and you get good ideas and good working your way through the problems to an effective solution. And everyone gets heard and they feel like they've contributed to that that discussion effectively. I think in New Zealand we tend to try and hide too much in this place.
In the harmony space. Oh my goodness, yes.
And we descend to conflict because we don't know how to do tension that well. And so I'm going to circle back around to that, but there's a couple of things I wanted to pick up on around individual board member traits, and I think that they would go to the pointy end for the chairperson. What I've heard you say, Deb, is that courage is really important, decisiveness is really important, and I'm going to drop in there curiosity.
Oh, yes.
What are the traits do you think are really like almost table stakes to be an effective director of a scale up, let's call it, and then perhaps you'd have to accelerate those as a chair?
I think you need to have, the courage and decisiveness comes with a willingness to admit you were wrong.
Yeah.
And so you should be able to have that robust debate. And even if you make the decision, you should be able to agree, actually, we made the wrong decision, let's fix this, and not hold on to that baggage. So, some people talk about it as having no ego. I don't think of it like that at all. The worst thing I think anyone can say is that they're humble, because that is not the way to get things done. So I like people on boards who are confident but respectful and willing to change their minds, basically.
Yes.
Because nobody knows everything about what's going to happen next.
No, nobody can see the future.
And so, that harmony thing, the nodding heads around the table just drives me crazy. And in fact, on boards where I'm not the chair, I'm often the one that causes the discussion to move to dissent.
Yes.
Sometimes, deliberately, even if it's not my actual inclination might be to agree with everyone. But in order to test whether that's right, I'll take a contrary view. I know sometimes it drives the chairman crazy. But someone at the table has to take that, I think of it as a kind of maverick seat.
Right.
Just to test that what we're deciding is robust.
Yes. Yeah, I love this. Yeah.
And then you get into the ridiculous discussions about how many people do you need, and even numbers is not a good thing because there might be a tie. If your board is voting on everything, on anything, one of two problems exist. Board decisions should be made by consensus. If you're going to vote on everything, it either means you've got the wrong people at the table, or it means that the chairman has not allowed the debate to flow enough for you to get to the point where you can reach consensus. Now, consensus doesn't mean that everyone agrees, of course. But what it does mean is that for the people who don't agree, they can accept. So there's this concept called disagree but commit.
Tell us more.
So if I disagree, but I'm willing to commit to the course of action that's been decided, because when the board leaves the room, it's the decision of the board, and you can't go out there and blab that, I didn't support that decision. Or it's very poor form for you to do that. And so that sense of, I can see why you all think that's the right thing to do. You haven't persuaded me that it is, but it's not Look, if they decide to do something that I consider to be completely egregious, sometimes even illegal, then my only recourse is to resign from the board. But there are things that boards decide that not everyone agrees with, but we can all live with, well, let's go and test whether that's going to work. So that is the construct of, I disagree, but I will commit to doing what I can do to make this decision succeed.
Yeah.
And to supporting the team to go down this route.
If it's not obvious for people that are watching this, the audience is founders, owners, and entrepreneurs. And so proportionally in New Zealand, a lot of small, medium companies don't have a board structure. So we've talked about what constitutes an effective board process to a degree. We've talked about the types of characters that succeed on there. But if I'm a founder without a board, sell me on the concept of having a board. Why should I have one?
To share the responsibility. You know, as you grow your business, look, you might be the 1% who are super competent and happy with the being in full control and willing to take the plus and minus from that. But everyone I come across mostly values getting advice on at least some of the things they're doing. And the board is there to help you test your decision making around what could be for your business and how you might achieve your actual goals. So, there's a huge industry around business mentoring and stuff like that. All of that is in the same space as having a board. The difference, and indeed you could form an advisory board, which is directly in the business mentoring space. Moving to a governance board is about sharing the legal responsibilities. Not for everyone, I would say, but I would think most founders would benefit from that.
Yeah.
Particularly if you're doing something that has, for example, high health and safety risks or those sorts of risks, high compliance risks.
Yes.
Those things, shared responsibility is actually a worthwhile thing.
Yeah. And picking up on a point you made earlier on, it's a very rare individual that kind of is all seeing, all doing, and understands everything that's going on and, all of the different spheres that constitute business success. I think of Napoleon Hill's work in the early 1900s. So 100-year-old text now, The Master Key to Riches. And he talks about the notion of a mastermind. And a mastermind is when you gather together a group of, in his instance, a group of men, but that's obviously a group of people is what he's referring to. And you give them a common problem that they can work towards solving, and you create the structure and the environment in which they can contribute equally, and there's a robust discussion, and everybody comes away with the sense that they have shared in that. They've grown as a consequence of getting other people's perspectives, and whatever outcome they're trying to solve for is a better outcome than would have been if there was just one person or two people in the room. I think Einstein famously said, and I'm probably misquoting him here, if there's two people in the room and we both share the same opinion, there may as well only be one.
Exactly.
And so a board is a process of having a mastermind and then having a robust discussion about how to get this to work.
And that's part of the foundation of why we talk about and I hesitate to bring this up, but why we talk about the importance of diversity on boards. Because there are two types of problem. Well, there are three types of problems in the world. One is a simple problem that everyone knows the answer to, but it's too hard to fix. The other two, they're complicated problems and they're complex problems. Now, a complicated problem is something like, how do I build a uranium extraction plant for a gold mine? Someone knows how to do that. There's a right answer. You go and find the expert and they design it and build it for you. It's not hard. Well, it's hard, but it's not an unknown. The solution is easy in a sense. Complex problems are the problems that boards are faced with. What country should we go into next? How much should we borrow from the bank? Should we raise more capital? Who should be the CEO? There's no right answer to any of those questions. And that's when bringing a group of people together who have different perspectives helps you reach a good decision, not necessarily the best decision, but a good decision. And when I talk about different perspectives, the thing that most creates that diversity is different life experiences. And so, I'm not a great fan of quotas or anything like that, but making sure the people on your board do not all have the same life experience is super important. And that's why so many of the big end boards are populated with people who don't fit that mould of having different life experience. We still see boards, certainly in New Zealand, but particularly in Australia, that are populated with lawyers and accountants and
pale, male, and stale.
It's just those different life experiences. Or so. Even how many countries you've lived in is one of the best examples of what drives diversity of thought at the board table.
Great question. What mistakes have you seen founders make when they go through the journey of establishing a board or when they're working with a board? What's some of the don't-dos?
Yeah, I mean, from the founder CEO perspective, the biggest don't-do is do not read your report to the board during the board meeting.
Right.
If the board hasn't read the report, then the chair should fire them all. But that's another story. But, that sense of make the most, the advice is make the most of the time you've got with this group of people. I prefer the founder to not be a director if they're in the CEO role. Well, if they're an executive in the company. And the reason for that is that at the board table, there's so many conflicts of interest going on. You've got, generally in these early stage businesses, you've got investor directors who obviously have interests from their investors and so on. You then put in the founder who has his own interests, again, a shareholder, so he's an investor as well. And I really want the founder CEO to have his CEO hat firmly on at that board table and be discussing with the board what he needs from them and not worrying about performing as a director as well. So my advice to founders is, yes, you're just like the VCs. Yes, you're entitled to appoint a director in terms of most of our shareholder agreement. Find someone you trust who has actual governance skills that fits in the skills matrix of the board and put them in your founder director seat. As the CEO, you're going to be at the board meeting for 90% of the time anyway.
Right.
So it's not like we're meeting in secret.
Yes.
It just makes for a much more effective relationship if everyone knows what hat they're wearing.
Yes, yeah. Is there anything else about governance that you'd would be super helpful for the audience that watches this show?
Don't be afraid. I think even if you start somewhere, start with one other director. Start with the person as an advisor, who you think will be a director. There's nothing wrong with I sometimes think of advisory boards as like governance training wheels. Start finding how it feels to have other people telling you what to do about your business. Presumably you already have a lawyer and an accountant telling you what to do about your business.
Yes.
Start testing how it feels to have someone else who maybe knows about your technical domain or something like that, giving you advice. And when you think that you're ready for that person or people like them to share the responsibility of growing the business, that's when you're ready for a board.
Yeah, great. So MVP it, in essence.
MVP it, absolutely.
And get yourself used to that structure, that environment, and feeling like as well you're reporting to people, even though you may not necessarily be.
Exactly.
That feeling.
That feeling of reporting to people, yes.
Yeah.
And it is hard. But in the end, I mean, when I handed over management to Ian, I was like, I can breathe.
More relief. Yeah, I love that.
Yeah. And a board should give you that. It should give you a sense that someone else is sharing in the responsibility of this really, really hard thing that you're doing.
It is.
And I think for some of the people watching presumably will be potential directors of some of these companies. And for those people, just do it. Just take your first role and do your due diligence, obviously.
Yes.
But don't be afraid of the fact that you haven't got governance experience.
Yes.
Learning to be a director is just another skill that you can acquire.
Right. Yeah, and you have to start with your first thing to be
Of
able
course,
to build the
of
experience
course. We
base.
all learn on the job.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I love that. Deb, you're a female founder from an era when there was not female founders, and you've spanned now another kind of generation or so. What is it that you would like to share with female founders that they would be really helpful for them to know in today's context, in today's environment?
You know, I think we talk a lot about how hard it is and how hard done by female founders are. If I could change one thing in New Zealand, I would stop this nonsense of quoting US figures for how little of investment money female founders get. That 1% or 2% number is simply not true in New Zealand.
Thank you.
And so, yes, female founders do get less investment than male founders. In part, there are fewer female founders than male founders, so that drives it. The second part of that is there are fewer female investors than male investors. That is driven by how much people earn and how many men and women get to senior roles in firms and so on. So, you know, it's all self-perpetuating. But the thing I would most say is stop. What if you reframe the problem as I'm a founder trying to do some really hard stuff, and there's money everywhere. I don't need to take women's only money. There are founders everywhere who could support me, and they don't have to be other female founders. You know, I think I've always taken the view of I don't join women's groups. I don't attend women-only events, or I try not to. I don't sit on women-only panels. And the reason for that is I don't see how by the women banding together we're going to change the world. Instead of banding together, and of course you need a support group of friends or fellow founders who you get together with and, you know, weep on each other's shoulders, that's absolutely fine. But out there in the real world, if you want to change things, you have to participate with the men. Yeah. I just don't get why there would be a fund that only invests in women founders because, well, firstly, that's not a financially sensible thing to do. It's like a construct, but and secondly, why wouldn't you bring in the whole diversity of the population? You know, I believe I thought that my generation had fixed all this. I was completely wrong. Completely wrong. When I see how my daughter has navigated her career, I know that I was completely wrong. There are still lots of things we have to fix. The way to fix those things is to change the men, to change the way we raise our sons. It has very little to do with how we raise our daughters. And, you know, the men that are problematic in our ecosystem, I look at their mothers and I say, you raised a self-entitled brat who was waited on hand and foot, and this is what he's become. How is that serving the women who are trying to stand shoulder to shoulder with other successful people? Stop having women's awards. Stop having the best woman business type stuff. That is not helpful. But yes, I absolutely acknowledge there's still work to be done. I'm just doing it differently.
In so many great ways, Deb. So we've known each other for about 10 years or so now, and I've always admired your expansive thinking around things. You've got a very sharp and a focused mind, so you're able to go from the big conceptual ideas down to micro detail very quickly. That's something that most people don't have. It's one of those forms of great intelligence. You're very open and contributory to conversations. So you've been really formative in behind the scenes of Flying Kiwi Angels, even though you came a little bit kind of midway along the journey with and for us. And there's, perhaps some interesting characters that you've had to navigate through that journey as well. And I really like the way that you are prepared to say things that perhaps others think, but don't necessarily feel the right way to voice those things. The PC things that people may tread around, especially that back end of the conversation that we had there. And so I really laud you for having the courage to say those things and speaking your mind in a very clear way. Not an opinionated way, but rather just very clear and concise about why that is important and what the solution is as well. It's not been a conversation about problems, but rather about kind of ways to navigate your way through this world of doing tricky things. Starting a business, owning a business, running a business and selling a business is hard as doing the hard things. And so today you've brought a lens which is quite different than other people that I've had on the show before. I love the conversation that we went deep into governance. Thank you so much. I think we'll do a future one in a year's time. We'll kind of double click on that one. And so, Deb, it's just been such a wonderful, wide-ranging conversation today. So thank you so much for coming on the show.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
If you enjoy these episodes, I hope you do. I love filming them, and the guests always say what a great and often cathartic experience it is for them. Then please do like and share. Hit me up on LinkedIn. I'm open to connect requests, and occasionally get emails from people as well asking me about my experience around certain subjects. So please do like and share, and continue to follow the show. I really appreciate your ears.